We had been hiking for hours, deep in the mountains, far from any kind of civilization. It was supposed to be a weekend adventure with my two best friends. The air was thin, and the forest around us felt unusually quiet. The trail we were following had become overgrown, and soon enough, we were completely off course, with the dense trees swallowing the path behind us. "I swear, this map isn't right anymore," I said, looking at the crumpled paper, useless in the growing dusk. "We'll be fine," one of my friends insisted, even though there was a hint of worry in his voice. The other nodded, though I could see he was starting to doubt it, too. We kept walking, but night fell faster than we had anticipated. Soon all we had were our flashlights, barely illuminating the narrow tree-choked path ahead. Then we heard it, a crunch of branches not far off. "Maybe an animal?" one of my friends whispered, but I could tell even he didn't believe it. We quickened our pace, but the sounds followed, growing closer. It wasn't the normal rustling of leaves or movement of wildlife. There was something deliberate about it, something human. Finally, we broke into a small clearing. A fire was burning there, flickering wildly, with strange dark shapes surrounding it. I stopped dead in my tracks, my friends behind me doing the same. Around the fire were bones, human bones, gnawed on and cracked open, scattered like trash. A figure stepped out of the shadows, their eyes wild, skin pale, and smeared with something dark. There was no mistaking it. They had been watching us, tracking us. "Run!" I screamed, but it was too late. My friends took off, but I froze, rooted in horror. The figure smiled, and that's when I noticed their teeth, sharp, filed to points. It wasn't just one of them. More of them appeared, their faces hollow, sunken in. By the time I snapped out of it, it was chaos. I could hear my friends screaming somewhere in the distance, but the woods seemed to stretch on forever. I ran blindly, my flashlight flickering, until I reached a cliff. There was no way out. Behind me, I heard them coming, the sounds of bones cracking beneath their feet as they closed in. The next morning, they found me, delirious, alone. My friends were never recovered, only fragments of clothing, stained with something too horrible to describe. The first time she mentioned the town, I didn't think much of it. My girlfriend had always been fascinated by strange, out-of-the-way places. She loved the idea of exploring forgotten history. So when she suggested we visit a remote village deep in the woods, I agreed, though with some hesitation. Something about the way she described it felt off. We arrived just as the sun was setting. The town was practically abandoned, the houses crumbling, the streets empty. There wasn't even a single car in sight. It felt like we were stepping into a ghost town, but she seemed unbothered. "I heard they have a tradition here," she said, leading me toward what looked like the center of the village. "They have this thing called the feast." "What kind of feast?" I asked, feeling a chill run down my spine. "Oh, you'll see." The way she said it made me uncomfortable. I noticed her behavior had changed slightly since we arrived. She was different, less like herself. Her voice had an eerie calmness to it. As the sun dipped below the horizon, we reached an old, decrepit house. Inside, a long table was set, laden with food that looked far too fresh for a place like this. There were meats, fruits, breads. It looked like a feast for royalty. "Sit," she said, her smile too wide, too unnatural. I sat down slowly, my hands trembling. Something about this wasn't right. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The shadows in the corners seemed to move, and the air was thick with an odd metallic smell. "You should try the meat," she said, her eyes gleaming. I picked up a piece of what looked like roast and took a hesitant bite. It was the taste that hit me first. It was wrong, bitter, too tender, almost familiar. She watched me closely, her grin widening. That's when I realized the feast wasn't for me. It was me. I spat the meat out, gagging as my stomach churned. The room seemed to close in, the walls pulsing with a strange rhythm. My girlfriend's face changed, her eyes cold, her smile cruel. The door slammed shut behind me. I finally ran away from that village and never even tried to come back. I have not even found any signs of my girlfriend coming back from that village, not even the police.
The house had been in my family for generations. It stood at the edge of a thick forest where the trees whispered secrets I never wanted to hear. After my parents passed, I inherited it, though I hadn't been back in years. Returning felt strange, like stepping into a past I'd long tried to forget. The first few days were peaceful enough. I spent my time cleaning up, going through old memories. But at night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I'd wake up to strange sounds, something moving in the walls, soft, rhythmic scraping that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Then I found the door. Hidden behind an old bookshelf in the basement, it was small and covered in dust. I hadn't remembered it being there. Curiosity got the better of me, and I pried it open. A staircase led down, deeper into the earth than I thought possible. As I descended, the air grew colder, and the smell, something foul, rotting, became overpowering. At the bottom, I found a room, and in that room, a table. On the table were bones, human bones. My mind raced. How could this be? I stumbled back, heart hammering, when I heard a voice, low, guttural, but unmistakably human. You came back. I spun around, but there was no one there. The room seemed to shrink, the walls closing in. I raced up the stairs, slamming the door behind me, trying to catch my breath. For days after, the voice haunted me. I would hear it in my sleep, whispering, calling to me. It wasn't until I found the old family journal that I learned the truth. My ancestors. They weren't just hunters. They were something far worse. And now I was part of it. I could feel the hunger growing inside me. It wasn't a choice. It never had been. The urge to feed, to consume, it was in my blood. And soon I wouldn't be able to fight it anymore.
I never suspected anything unusual about my wife. We'd been married for 6 years, and though she was a bit reserved, I always figured that was just part of who she was. She wasn't the kind of person to share everything, but I didn't mind. I thought I knew her well enough. It started with the smell. A faint, sour odor began wafting through the house late at night, usually coming from the kitchen or the basement. I assumed it was just the trash needing to be taken out or something spoiling in the fridge. But no matter how much I cleaned, the smell persisted. My wife always brushed it off, saying I was imagining things, or that maybe an animal had gotten trapped somewhere in the walls. One evening, she left the house unexpectedly, saying she had to visit a friend in the next town. I found it strange since she rarely left the house without telling me beforehand, but I didn't question it. As soon as the door closed behind her, the smell hit me again, stronger this time. I decided to investigate. I started in the kitchen, checking the fridge and pantry, but everything seemed normal. Then I remembered the basement. My wife had always been particular about the basement, rarely letting me down there. She claimed it was just storage and old junk, but now I felt compelled to look for myself. The door was locked as usual, but this time I went searching for the spare key she had hidden in the drawer by the bed. My hands trembled as I unlocked the door and descended the creaky stairs. The deeper I went, the stronger the smell became, filling my nose with a thick, rancid stench. At the bottom of the stairs, I flicked on the light, and immediately I felt my stomach twist. The walls were lined with shelves, covered in jars, jars filled with odd fleshy substances floating in murky liquid. I stared at them, horrified, my mind refusing to accept what I was seeing. I turned around, and there it was, a large industrial freezer tucked into the corner of the basement, humming quietly. I had never noticed it before, but then again I had never come down here. I didn't want to open it. I knew, deep down, that whatever was inside was the source of the smell. But my hand moved on its own, drawn by some terrible curiosity. I grabbed the handle and pulled. Inside were neatly wrapped packages, sealed in plastic. They were labeled not with the usual food names, but with something far worse. Dates, and in some cases, names. My breath caught in my throat as I realized what I was looking at. This wasn't animal meat. This wasn't something innocent. This was flesh. Human flesh. I stumbled back, my heart racing, bile rising in my throat. My legs felt weak as I tried to process the horror before me. How long had this been going on? Who were these people? I heard the door upstairs creak open. She was back. I slammed the freezer shut, trying to compose myself, trying to make sense of how my life had spiraled into this nightmare. Footsteps echoed down the hallway above, soft but deliberate. She was coming down. I turned to face the basement stairs just as she appeared at the top, her expression unreadable. Her eyes darted to the open door, then to me, her face remaining eerily calm. "You weren't supposed to see that," she said, her voice low, almost regretful. I couldn't speak. My mouth was dry, my limbs frozen. I wanted to ask why, how, but no words came out. She started down the stairs, slowly, her eyes never leaving mine. "I didn't want you to find out like this," she continued, her tone disturbingly steady, like we were discussing something mundane. "But now that you know, there's no going back." I backed away, my hands shaking. What is this?" I managed to choke out, though I already knew the answer. She didn't respond. Instead, she reached into her bag, pulling out something shiny, something sharp. "I need you to understand," she said softly, stepping closer. "This is just who I am." I ran. I didn't think. I just bolted up the stairs, past her, knocking over a table as I scrambled for the door. I could hear her footsteps behind me, calm, steady. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I made it to the front door, throwing it open and stumbling out into the night. I kept running, through the yard, down the road, not stopping until I reached the neighbor's house half a mile away. They called the police. When they arrived, I was still shaking, trying to explain what I had found. But when they searched the house, the basement was spotless. The freezer was gone. The jars were gone. And so was she. I haven't seen my wife since that night. Sometimes I wonder if she's still out there, living somewhere else, carrying on as if nothing happened. But every time I hear a faint, sour smell in the air, I wonder if she's closer than I think. My sister had always been the responsible one, the one who took care of me when our parents were too busy with their own lives. She was 8 years older, and growing up, I idolized her. She moved out when I was still a teenager, heading off to college, and eventually settling in a small, isolated town a few hours away. We stayed in touch, but over the years, the distance between us grew. Not just physically, but emotionally. I figured it was just the natural drift of life, until I got the call. She invited me to visit. It had been years since we'd spent any real time together, and I was excited about reconnecting with her. But there was something odd in her voice that I couldn't quite place. It sounded colder, more distant, like she wasn't really herself. Still, I pushed the unease aside and agreed to make the trip. The drive to her house took me deeper into the countryside than I had ever been before. Her house was in a rural area, surrounded by dense woods that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. It felt like the kind of place people went to disappear. When I arrived, the first thing I noticed was how different she looked. My sister had always been lively, full of energy, but the woman who greeted me at the door seemed hollow, her skin pale and stretched tight over her bones. Her eyes, once warm and bright, were now dull and glassy, as though they'd seen too much. "Glad you made it," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. I hugged her, but even her embrace felt stiff, like she was going through the motions. The house was cold, darker than I remembered. She led me to the living room where she'd set out some food, oddly thick dark meat I couldn't quite place. "Local game," she explained. I didn't ask more. My stomach churned at the sight of it. Instead, I tried to make small talk, asking about her life, her work. But she deflected every question, turning the conversation back to me. The hours passed slowly. The air in the house felt heavy, and the smell of that meat lingered, thick and almost metallic. As evening crept in, she suggested we take a walk in the woods, like we used to do as kids. I hesitated but agreed, hoping to shake the strange tension that had settled between us. The woods were unnaturally quiet, no birds, no rustling leaves, just an eerie stillness. She walked ahead, leading me deeper into the forest, her steps sure, even though it was nearly impossible to see where we were going. "Do you remember when we were little?" she asked suddenly, her voice soft. "How we'd play hide-and-seek out here?" I nodded, though my mind was racing. I had no memory of playing in woods like this. In fact, these woods didn't resemble anything from our childhood at all. "We used to find things," she continued, "things buried deep in the ground." "What things?" I asked, my voice sounding small. She stopped, turning to face me, her eyes now darker than before, locked onto mine. "You were too young to remember, but I've been digging them up again." A chill ran through me. Something was very wrong. "What are you talking about?" She didn't answer. Instead, she knelt down, brushing aside the leaves at her feet, revealing a patch of freshly disturbed earth. I stepped back, my heart pounding. That's when I saw it, a glimpse of something beneath the dirt. White, jagged, bones. My breath caught in my throat. "What the hell is this?" She smiled, but it wasn't my sister's smile. It was something else, something darker, twisted. "I've been learning things," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "Things about what we are, where we came from." I felt a cold sweat break out on my skin. "You're scaring me." "I didn't want you to find out like this," she continued, almost as if she hadn't heard me. "But you're a part of it too. We all are. It's in our blood. The hunger, the need." I stumbled back, my mind reeling. "What hunger?" Her smile grew wider. "Don't you feel it deep down? The need to consume? To take what's ours?" My stomach churned with nausea, and I turned, ready to run, but she grabbed my arm, her grip stronger than I expected. "Don't fight it," she said softly. "It's who we are." I ripped my arm free, bolting through the trees, my breath ragged, my heart pounding. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I had to get away. The trees blurred past me, and the air grew colder with each step. Behind me, I could hear her, calling my name in that same calm, eerie voice. But I didn't stop. I kept running. Finally, I burst out of woods and into the clearing near her house. My car was in sight. I threw myself it, started the engine, and went far away. After that, I haven't spoken to her, and she hadn't tried to contact me. Sometimes, late at night, I think about that smile, the way her eyes darkened, the way she spoke about our blood like it was some kind of curse. And sometimes, when I'm alone, I wonder if she was right, if somewhere, deep inside me, that hunger is waiting. But I try not to think about that too much. I hadn't seen my uncle in years. He was my dad's older brother, but they hadn't been close for as long as I could remember. I never knew the full story of why they drifted apart. Only bits and pieces I overheard at family gatherings. Hints of some unspoken conflict that no one in the family wanted to address directly. My dad never talked about it, and I never pressed him on it growing up. Uncle Tom was always the strange, quiet figure on the fringes of the family. He lived in a remote cabin deep in the woods, far from town, and rarely came to family events. When he did, he mostly kept to himself, never really engaging with anyone. But everything changed after my dad died. I was grieving, lost in a way I hadn't expected to be. My father and I had been close, and his sudden death from a heart attack left a huge void in my life. A few weeks after the funeral, my uncle reached out to me. He called me out of the blue, his voice sounding older than I remembered. Raspier, almost like he hadn't spoken to anyone in years. He expressed his condolences and told me I should come visit him at his cabin. Said we had things to talk about, things my father never shared with me. I was hesitant, of course. I barely knew him. My dad had kept me away from him, and that distance had always felt like it was there for a reason. But in my grief, I was desperate for some kind of connection, some way to feel closer to my father, even if it was through a man he had distanced himself from. I figured maybe it was time to mend whatever broken ties existed in the family. Maybe I could learn something about my dad that I never knew. So, one weekend, I decided to make the drive to his cabin. It was a long trip, nearly 4 hours from the city, winding through increasingly narrow and overgrown roads. The deeper I went into the woods, the more isolated I felt. I passed no other cars, no houses, not even any signs of human life for miles. By the time I finally reached his place, the sky was starting to turn a dusky orange, and the air had that chilly, damp feel of an approaching storm. His cabin looked exactly as I remembered it. Old, weathered, with a sagging roof and moss growing up the sides. The place had an unsettling stillness about it, like it had been forgotten by time. I pulled into the driveway, gravel crunching under my tires, and sat in the car for a moment, staring at the cabin. Something didn't feel right, but I couldn't put my finger on it. The door creaked open before I could knock, and there he was, my uncle, looking even more gaunt and hollow than I expected. His skin was pale, stretched tight over his face, and his eyes were dark, shadowed, like he hadn't slept in days. His clothes hung loose on his frame, and his beard was wild, unkempt. "Glad you came," he said, his voice a low rasp. I nodded, offering a forced smile as he motioned for me to come inside. The interior of the cabin was just as run down as the outside, dimly lit, cluttered with old, dusty furniture. It smelled musty, with a faint metallic scent lingering in the air that made me uneasy. The atmosphere felt heavy, like something oppressive was hanging in the air, weighing down the space. I brushed off the feeling as nerves and followed him into the small living room. He didn't offer me anything to drink or eat, didn't ask how I was holding up after my dad's death. Instead, he sat down in a worn-out armchair and motioned for me to sit across from him. For a long while, we sat in silence. I could hear the wind picking up outside, rustling the trees, and somewhere in the distance the low rumble of thunder. Finally, he spoke. "Your father never told you about our family, did he?" I frowned, unsure of what he meant. "What do you mean?" He leaned forward, his dark eyes locking onto mine. "There are things about our family you don't know, things he didn't want you to know." A cold knot of unease twisted in my stomach. "Like what?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he stood up and walked over to a small table in the corner of the room. He pulled out a bottle of whiskey and poured himself a glass, downing it in one gulp before turning back to me. "Did he ever tell you why we stopped speaking?" he asked, his voice lower now, almost a whisper. No, I admitted. He never talked about it. My uncle let out a bitter laugh. Of course he didn't. He wanted to protect you from the truth. I shifted uncomfortably in my seat. What truth? He stared at me for a long moment, his eyes unreadable. Then, without warning, he walked toward the door leading to the basement. "Come with me," he said, opening the door and descending the creaky wooden stairs. Every instinct in me screamed to leave, to get out of that cabin and never look back. But something pulled me down those stairs after him. Maybe it was my need for answers. Maybe it was the strange hold his words had over me. The basement was dark and cold, and it reeked of that metallic scent I'd noticed earlier. But now it was stronger, almost overwhelming. My uncle lit a single dim bulb, casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. The basement was cluttered with old tools, boxes of forgotten things, and a large, rusted metal table in the center of the room. But it was what was hanging on the walls that made my blood run cold. There were hooks, large metal hooks, with things hanging from them. At first, I couldn't process what I was looking at. My mind refused to accept it, but then the realization hit me like a punch to the gut. They were bones, human bones. I took a step back, my heart racing, my mind scrambling for an explanation. "What the hell is this?" I stammered, my voice trembling. My uncle stood next to the table, his face eerily calm. "This is the truth, kid. This is what your father didn't want you to know." I shook my head, backing away toward the stairs. No, this can't be real. He didn't stop me. He just stood there, watching me, his expression almost sympathetic. He tried to get away from it. My uncle continued, his voice calm, almost conversational. "He thought he could leave it behind, but you can't outrun your own blood." I couldn't breathe. The air in the basement felt thick, suffocating. "What are you talking about?" I demanded, my voice shaking. "What is this?" He took a step toward me, his eyes dark and hollow. "Our family has a history, a legacy, you could say. Something ancient, something primal." I shook my head, my back hitting the wall. "You're insane." "Am I?" He let out a slow, eerie chuckle. "Look around, kid. This is who we are. This is what we do." I wanted to run, to get out of that basement, out of that cabin, but my legs wouldn't move. I was frozen, trapped in the nightmare he had dragged me into. "I've been doing this for years," he said, walking toward the hooks, running his fingers over the bones like they were some kind of twisted trophies. "Your father and I, we were both raised in it. It's in our blood. But he wanted out. He thought he could live a normal life, pretend like it never happened." He turned to face me, his eyes dark and wild. "But you can't escape it. The hunger. It always comes back." I shook my head, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "You're sick. You need help." He laughed again, a low, chilling sound. "I'm not the one who needs help. You're part of this too, whether you like it or not." I pushed past him, stumbling up the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I burst through the door, out into the cold night air, gasping for breath. I ran to my car, fumbling with the keys, my hands shaking uncontrollably. As I sped away from the cabin, my mind raced. What had I just seen? What was my uncle talking about? Was it all some kind of sick joke? Or had my father really kept this dark, twisted secret from me my entire life? I don't know. I never went back to that cabin. I never spoke to my uncle again. But sometimes, late at night, I can still hear his voice in my head, whispering about the hunger. And sometimes I feel it too.